The proceeding is currently suspended. The proceeding is currently suspended. The proceeding is currently suspended. The proceeding is currently suspended.
Dr Campbell, Mr Abrams, welcome. I think you've been listening to the earlier part of the evidence, and can I thank you for the very comprehensive written evidence which you provided for us and which I really enjoyed reading yesterday afternoon. And thank you, Mr Abrams. We've got your oil and gas, but I haven't had a chance. I think that's only just arrived. I haven't had a chance to read that, but the committee are very appreciative of all that. Baroness Kramer.
Thank you. That's well, welcome. But I think is it probably more Mr McVeigh and Dr Campbell have some experience of how the change in arrangements has worked in the public sector. And we've heard from HMRC that it's been extremely successful. And I just wondered if you might give us your point of view that's on the implementation and the operation of the off-payroll rules in the public sector.
Yep.
Whichever of you wants to go first, please.
Right. I'm not surprised that HMRC would say that in their view it's been very successful. I think they only have one metric, which is what their tax take has been out of the assessment. What we are seeing is that on the ground, all the genuinely self-employed people within that cohort cannot, in fact, get that status. We are seeing that individual assessments do not occur. We are seeing blanket determinations applied to, in cases, thousands of workers at once, entire professions within various engaging organisations, when the law actually should say that you get individual assessments with reasonable care in every instance. Indeed, our organisation, Judicial, reviewed NHS Improvement on that very point, and I should say a number of others, and one on each count, settled in pre-action phase. And part of what we co-authored with them, the guidance that was updated, was that you should get individual assessments with reasonable care. This occurred only for a space of, we're talking months, before a webinar was organised with HMRC, their R35 lead, Mark Frampton, then came in and basically undermined our settlement agreement by saying that all the workers should be blanketed. He said that on 7 occasions. We can actually provide you with a recording if you'd wish. We've got the full recording of the webinar.
That would be very useful.
Are we allowed?
Yeah. There was no caveat given on...
Excuse me one second, I
Sorry,
just need to... I think we need to just take advice on whether we can accept that in evidence.
No problem,
yeah.
No problem.
House rules rather than any inhibitions.
Not at all. You would be welcome to it if you can accept it. I'd be very glad to give it to you. It's about 300 megabytes, so we need to make arrangements. But yes,
well, if there's a transcript, maybe that might be acceptable. I don't know, whatever the rules are.
We're currently working on a transcript.
Perhaps we can work that out with the clerk offline. Yeah,
no problem. So this webinar essentially on basically all the occasions bar one, there was no caveat given, just essentially blanket assess all the workers at once. This where the actual, if you look at the case law, you're supposed to take an overall view of the big picture. You talk about painting the full picture and stepping back and looking at the entire engagement. If you look at the legislation, the duty arises on a per contract basis. You're supposed to even look at the way the company's set up. I mean, how can you tell whether the individual has adequate shareholding even for the legislation to apply without looking at an individual basis? HMRC just essentially came along and said, look, you are all caught, and unfortunately the reality is that there are perishingly few healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, you're talking even dietitians, pharmacists working within the NHS that actually escape the legislation, even where these people have no job security. They can be disposed of in 1 to 4 hour notice periods. They can make losses against that. I indeed personally have made a loss on contracts that I have taken where I had commitments to accommodation costs, and thankfully I'm pleased as a medic. I'm never sorry to see the health service recruiting doctors. That's a great news. But when that happens and you've travelled across the country, paid for accommodation, and you end up making quite considerable loss in that case. On the engagement, you are in a business, you're an account, you are at financial risk in the engagement you're taking, and that's not a theoretical risk, that's a practical risk that happened. The revenue, of course, disregarded all this and essentially led them along the line of saying that you should do one assessment for each class of worker and find them all caught. We didn't say find them all caught, but that was the sort of general thrust of it. Again, as you discussed beforehand on mutuality of obligations and all that sort of thing, in my view, what they were doing is, to be very frank about it, dishonest. They were taking a case law test from another area of law with a similar name, which almost can bamboozle lay people, so to speak. Contract law has a concept of mutuality of obligations, and they were using that definition. Now, that is a test for whether or not a contract exists, not the nature of that contract. So if you look at contract law, they will say, is there a mutuality of obligation? This is why you get peppercorn payments and all that kind of thing to satisfy it. I mean, literally, a peppercorn can satisfy that test. Whereas in employment law, what they're really looking at, if we're going to put it simply, is security of contract, security of your role, your job, effectively. And that test looks for an irreducible minimum. Is it sufficiently strong to render one party master and the other servant? And by supplanting one test with the other, HMRC has effectively overlooked one of the key factors in what constitutes genuine self-employment. Are you at risk? Is your home at risk? I mean, could you end up suddenly with no work? With no, you know, if you fall sick, as happens in life, and you can't get any work for 6 months, you know, what happens there? These are the financial risks that HMRC is trying to disregard by deliberately trying to omit mutuality of obligations. So I think that gives you a kind of flavour of where we're coming from. I'm sure we'll be discussing in more detail shortly, but suffice it to say we are not best impressed with how things have gone, and we think it's a danger to patients as well, because workers will not travel, essentially, so they won't fly across the country as they used to do to cover shifts at short notice, and this fuels rota gaps. Of course, that's multifactorial, but it's, we think, a major contributing factor. We've got evidence that can supply later on if you wish to delve into more detail about the degree to which that has occurred.
That would be very helpful.
Yeah.
So
I just wondered if just Mr McVeigh wanted to add something from a different
thank you, Baroness Kramer. As Lord Forsyth said earlier on, you're seldom wrong, but I actually don't represent the public sector. I represent private sector, film and TV companies across the UK.
I think it was more that you had a perspective that...
well, we definitely have a perspective on IR35.
You do represent the BBC?
No, I don't represent.
Oh, you don't
BBC.
have BBC members?
No, BBC isn't one of my membership. We're all private sector members.
Oh,
okay.
So,
Okay, right.
But I also...
My apologies.
No,
we were both.
as I said, you're very seldom wrong, and I apologies for correcting. But I also sit on the Creative Industries Council, and I was the sector lead for the sector deal under the previous government's industrial strategy. And of course, the creative industries represent over 70,000 SMEs across the UK. They're growing at twice the rate of the UK economy and creating more jobs, freelance jobs, at the rate of the economy. And of course, my sector, the film and television industry, has long used freelance, self-employed, craft and technical people to work on various films, TV programmes, adverts, etc. And of course, the big problem that this throws up is at any one time we end up in conflict with the people we want to employ, because I may deem them to be a properly self-employed contracted company, because I'm of the size of the company that has to make that determination. But another company of my size might determine that they're not, and that will cause conflict, as we heard in the previous session. But of course, for many of my smaller member companies who don't come or below the threshold, they won't be subject to making these determinations, but they'll be hiring people who are being determined by others. So the conflict will come where someone might say, well, I used to work on this programme, and because I was determined to be at a certain employment status, I put my rates up to cover the additional burden. I'm now going to apply those rates to every other subsequent job as well. So we worry considerably, and not just in my sector, but I think across the creative industries, that this will be inflationary. Of course, that may be what the revenue are looking for in terms of seeking to get more revenues for the public purses. But that will put a real burden on SMEs across the country at a time when they are seeking to grow their businesses, become more global, I mean, if we're making a TV programme and my production company might only employ 10 full-time staff, but if I get a commission from the BBC, I might go on to hire 300 people in order to make that production. But next year, I may not be hiring 300 people. I may not have any work because I didn't get a commission. So when you're working in the creative industries, you have no advance order book. You generally have very low fixed employees, and you hire in contractors and self-employed freelancers in order to complete the work, and whether that's in fashion or in film and TV, that is how we remain efficient and competitive. So we're very concerned that this is going to create confusion for the people we'd like to hire, a burden on employers, because this will be a burden. And also worse than that, if we're in dispute with HMRC and I've hired Dr Iain Campbell Limited, and I've deemed that he's actually an employee, but someone else has deemed that he's not for a similar job on another production, the revenue may take a dispute with an employer, but by the time that dispute, and I may have to pay the revenue for whatever costs they deemed have not been paid, Dr Iain Campbell might have gone bust, and I may not be able to recover my liabilities from Dr Iain Campbell, who may have had a benefit, and that is a horrible confusion for everyone concerned.
So how will you resolve it?
I think I'll go to your earlier point. I think some alignment of employment law here would be very rational.
No, but as the system is now, how would you resolve it?
Well, generally we always had, the burden was always placed on the person presenting us.
No, with the new rules after April, how would you resolve it?
We don't see, the problems I've just outlined, I don't see how we can resolve them under the current HMRC guidance.
Well, if I were you, I would resolve it by assuming he was employed.
But if he says, I don't want to be employed, I want to be treated as a contractor, and I agree to that, because he's the only person who can do that job for that
But
production.
if you wanted to limit your risk, you wouldn't agree to it.
Sorry?
If you wanted to limit your risk, you wouldn't agree to it.
I wouldn't agree to it, but if he's the only person that I can hire to do the job, he's a specialist director of photography for a drama, which is costing £20 million to make, and there is also a burden on the employer that way. There are only a limited number of people at a certain level. So I would say, I want to make you an employee. He says, no, I don't want to be treated like that, in order to facilitate the production, because these are time-based prototypical products. I say that, the revenue then say, oh no, that was wrong at some future point, and I will end up in dispute with the revenue if I can't recover whatever costs I then have to pay to the revenue, because he no longer exists as an entity. Then that's a huge cost and a huge unknown to business, particularly at a time when, for my sector, we're the number 2 audiovisual economy in the world.
Yeah.
And that is a real burden being placed on very fast, very competitive businesses seeking to export that product into the global markets. And to your earlier point from a gentleman about our current trading status as we go through Brexit, I think we should be doing everything to advantage our competitive businesses.
Sorry, Baroness Kramer, I interrupted your question.
No, please. I'm sure there are other people who want to come in on this issue.
Lord Desai?
I was just wondering, one of the things which has emerged from what you said, that a genuinely self-employed person faces uncertainty of employment. And therefore there is a risk element to genuine self-employment, which is not bad if you're just signing some sort of contract but you're really employed.
Yes.
Is there any way you have thought that one could make that distinction into the tax law?
I mean, you actually are going towards what we had suggested actually as an alternative solution for this. If you look at all these case law tests, by the way, brilliantly thought out, the judiciary have done an excellent job, but you need a specialist. And that means you need to hire experts. I mean, to suggest that normal clients are competent to do this when HMRC gets it wrong is verging on ridiculous. What we'd suggested was basically that you need to create statutory terms of employment and self-employment, certain terms that might be implied into the contract automatically by an election made around, say, contract security and all this sort of thing, abolish the uncertainty driving a lot of this. But then you'll have the question of the people who, say, might elect to become self-employed under such a system who perhaps would not appear so if a court were to consider it. I think we're talking about a minority there, small minority in our view, but certainly that exists. And I would suggest a solution to that, our solution we've proposed is very similar actually to what IPSI suggested to you only about 10 minutes ago, which is we'd suggested you effectively sample, say, 10,000, 1,000 contractors, get them professionally assessed by an expert, well versed in the case law, work out what the true scale, and don't rely on HMRC, that's the first rule, work out what the true scale of what we call disguised employment, to use HMRC's term, is, and then just put a levy on all contracts to recoup about the same amount. You'll have almost no administrative burden in so doing. Most of the money avoided is employers' NICs, and you give certainty of contract to everybody. That, I think, is a more efficient solution with less admin, less burden, and I think it's far fairer. And I don't think contractors would object to it. Obviously, there'll be, if you charge the client a certain amount, that will be passed on to contractors because that's the way economies work. There are market forces involved, but I think the amount is going to be probably a small percentage, and that's probably how we would handle it. Were we in the position to set the rules, which unfortunately we're not.
Mr. Abrams, you haven't said anything. Did you want to say anything?
No, no problem. My two colleagues on the left have cut me to the
Point. Lord Bridges.
Can we just see so many sectors speaking with one voice?
Just coming back onto costs. Maybe, Mr. Abrams, you in your evidence, which thanks, and thanks for all your evidence, you're saying that the costs to members has been significant. Do you think that the government's assessment of, HMRC's rather, estimate of the one-off costs at 14.4 million is accurate, understatement? What do you think about that for your members? I mean, would you like to
Our members are, they have spent a significant amount of time, money, effort, hiring other people to assess this, to actually work out what the best possible options are for all parties in our supply chain. And I should say here, I don't just represent the oil and gas companies, I also represent all our supply chain members, and I'm here as Supply Chain Director for Oil and Gas UK. And on that regard, the costs are incremental across the whole of the chain. And when we look at the amount of effort we're putting into trying to work out what is the best way of handling the changes, we tried to put a number on this, and all we ended up with, it's in thousands and thousands of man hours put into this so far. And by the time you actually work out the cost of that, it is unlikely that the current estimate is correct.
We wouldn't have a hard number, but we'd agree, particularly for the sort of medium-sized companies who, I mean, if you look at ITV, which is our commercial broadcaster, but it has a large production entity, much like the BBC, and they hire thousands of freelancers on many different projects, programmes all over the country. In fact, filming here and filming around the world, they'd be British freelancers hired onto those shows. So the overall burden for processing all of that will be way in excess, just for the creative industries probably, of what the HMRC suggests.
Do you want to add anything into that?
And I think the thing with the administrative burden is that there is an administrative burden of actual compliance, which I think is extremely onerous, verging on almost impossible to achieve properly. And there's the reality, which is that the admin burden is so much that they will simply not comply.
So can I just come on to that, because I was very interested in your evidence, your written evidence, that you cite the Colchester CEO of the Trust saying that they are down 100 additional nursing shifts per week as a result of IR35.
Yes.
Is there further evidence from the NHS of that kind of impact, not putting aside the costs?
Yes, the thing to bear in mind when you're looking at that is that much of the pain here is concentrated in the hospitals that are hardest to recruit for. So if you go looking for evidence from central London hospitals that are all very oversubscribed and get no problem attracting trainees, these hospitals are probably not struggling, and that's what they will tell you, simply because they already have enough substantive workers. The pain is felt in the rural areas, the hard-to-get areas, where obviously they struggle to attract both substantive staff and contract workers. If we look at, I was looking through NHS professionals data, which is the system that agencies subscribe to. I know it's labelled NHS Actually Company, but it's semi-publicly owned, as far as I understand it. But hospitals basically advertise the vacancies through them, and we could look at fill rates, and what we could see was that the fill rate had dropped by 50%, in some cases up to 75%, looking at various hospitals, at a time of contemporaneous surge in demand. So what you're seeing is that any reduction in spend there is probably actually down to the fact that they're not hiring workers, and any shall we say, any fool can spend less money on healthcare by hiring less workers, and you're effectively buying less healthcare, essentially. So what they've done is effectively reduced the number of workers they're getting in. You can see the demand responding to it by coming up. These reforms are making it difficult to attract people, and the primary reason is they're not commuting expenses. Because if you think what would happen, I would get a phone call, they would say, there is a hospital struggling, can you go there? And it might be, I mean, not that I don't do A&E, but that maybe is a good example to think of, or an intensive care unit somewhere. That worker then buys a plane ticket, flies across the country, or perhaps a train, whatever it's going to be, pays for accommodation, which might be privately in hotels, which might be hospital accommodation, depending where it's available, but there's a charge for that. They're not willing to do that because these can be tens of thousands of pounds of expenses against which business loss can be made, which effectively are footed from your own post-tax pocket. And if it gets cancelled, as happens, 1 to 4 hour notice periods are the norm. If it gets cancelled, that's a loss you make. So it's much easier to stomach that as a pre-tax business expense, which is what in my view it really is, as it is than it is to basically foot it from your own pocket. And this applies equally to those on the big incomes, as it does on those who are, say, dietitians, or maybe some of the less skilled, even below that, some of the unskilled health workers that are doing contract work as well, even cleaning and catering. They'll end up footing this themselves. So I think there's a real injustice there in terms of the expenses, and it's hindering service delivery. So we've actually got some, from Freedom of Information Act requests out, and we've only recently discovered that data is passed back to NHS Trust, which is of course the point at which we can obtain it through Freedom of Information. So we may be able to supply you with more information in the next few weeks or so, barring, shall we say, obstruction to the request. We should be able to supply you with that data.
I think that would be very helpful. I think we would very much like to see the impact on the NHS or anywhere else in the public sector. Lord Bridges.
So just looking at the public sector's experience of this, can you just remind the committee, in terms of the time it took to get a notice to implement this, can you remind us of the timescale that was? So that the time between which the final details were known and the implementation date, what was that period?
You mean public sector reforms?
Yeah.
I don't recall off the top of my head exactly, but you're talking about a period of, it was announced, it must have been around 2016, I think, the first sounds of it. I'm going from memory there, so I may be slightly off. And then about 12 months, really, where we sort of had an idea of what was going on. However, I think the problem a lot of contractors had was they looked at this and they, sort of, if they were relatively switched on, they would read around some employment status case law and think, well, that's obviously not me. I have no problem. You need to look a bit deeper to see the sort of, what you could almost say, subtly coercive nature of what's going on, where they divorce the liable party, the one that's got the risk element, from the one that's got the benefit, and then hand the decision to the one with the risk. What do you think they're going to do? They make risk-averse decisions, whereas obviously it ought to be, as a matter of fact, in reality, if you give them the decision, they're going to say, well, what exposes my business or my...
So just in terms of, so you had, say, 12 months, but just turning to Mr Abrams and Mr McVeigh, in terms of what we know now, and in terms of the fact that the Chancellor was saying over the weekend he's going to make tweaks and improvements, what tweaks and improvements would satisfy you to make sure that this could be implemented in this current time frame that's expected?
I refer you to it. We've made 3 separate submissions on this so far. The work that's been done it's very difficult to understand the definitive end status of everybody involved in this, and companies are making decisions as best they can as to who's going to be affected in the different ways. We are seeing differences of opinions in that, so some certainty out of the tools that say how people should be affected would be good, but based on their own statistics, when only 85% can be actually guaranteed, pushing that towards certainty would make a significant improvement on the situation that we have at the moment. But from our members' perspective, where we are right now, with 6 weeks towards the go live on the implementation of this, it's very last minute to actually, we spent a lot of time and money trying to get ready for this, and I refer to some of the previous evidence you heard in the session. It's unfortunate now we are where we are, but as it stands, we have ambiguity in our members to whether or not they were prepared to go ahead with the system as it is and live with it, or to actually to ask an extension to take it from here. So it's one of those 2 situations where we're kind of between 2 stools.
Well, I think from us testing the sort of determination, the tools, they tend to always say that someone's employed. when generally they're not the case. They're working on multiple contracts for multiple employers on very different productions all over the country. So that's one of the major problems, that getting a clarity of determination for employers and for employees so that they know how they will be treated. We don't want conflict with highly skilled individuals that we want to hire on to work on our productions. And if this will throw up more conflict. So clarity, I mean, I think fundamentally, I think it was a previous comment, was, what should we be doing now that we come out of the EU? Well, probably reforming our whole tax base into making it simpler and clearer for the British public and businesses to understand going forward. And this does not seem to be one of the ways to do that.
Baroness Kramer.
Can I just a very quick question on the contractors themselves? Because I think, Dr Campbell, you basically said a number of hospitals, particularly in the less popular regions of the country, are now finding they can't find people to employ. Where are they? Are these people simply stopping working, or are they selling their services elsewhere? And I wonder with Dr Bouvet, and we're picking up anecdotally only, but at least I have been, that a number of operations are basically seeking now to employ their specialists outside of the UK as a way to get around this, Ireland being one of the popular places to do it. I just wondered if you're seeing any of that as a sort of...
So as ever, a very insightful question. We'd obviously say engage towards, avoid the word employ, which is in such context slightly loaded, but you're absolutely cut straight to the heart of the matter. What's happening is many people are working less, so they undertake fewer hours, which obviously is very counterproductive from HMRC's point of view. These are people who, in many instances, earn a lot of tax per hour. So if you encourage them to undertake less work, you're not going to make as much money as you would otherwise. Especially so as once they reach certain levels of income, you start seeing things like the tapering of their personal allowance and that sort of thing, which obviously again disincentivises them to work further. So cutting hours is one major theme. The other thing is a lot of workers have plain left. The Office of National Statistics data that I think I've forwarded to you attached to the evidence was showing that 12,000 medics have left the country. I'd say medics, that includes surgeons, and are working abroad as a result. Obviously, you can see there's no effective Brexit in the first year, and straight after the reforms come in, that's when this drop occurs. So, again, that's the other side of it, and again, you lose tax take from that. I think those are the two sides of it, working less and working abroad. Those are the other things. And we live in a kind of very global world, regardless of the Brexit thing. What you'll see is workers will migrate, and we ought to be thinking about how we can attract people here and make it a good place to come, a good place to undertake work and help our health service, rather than disincentivising that.
What about the argument that says that actually by employing contractors as opposed to full-time employed people, the health service is having to spend vastly more money than they would otherwise have to spend?
So there is, I suppose to put it in context, there's an argument there to an extent. Of course, the reason that there is this differential is that there is a monopsonistic buying force effectively from the health service and a monopoly on training, and the result is that health professionals are remunerated far below their market worth. And that's where this differential occurs. Now, almost what I would say is treat your substantive staff better. The way to address this is market forces, actually, not rate caps. You need to look at training more. You need to make the working conditions better. The other side of it is if we could recruit the workers, we wouldn't have need for the locum cover anyway. So it's about maintaining safe levels. And if you don't, you're actually going to drive rates up, because what happens is the working conditions get more stressful. It's a response to market forces. I hope that makes sense.
In reply, well, we're not sort of dealing with this yet, but to your point, we work in a very mobile industry. The UK is undergoing a boom in terms of film and television, and it's attracting very highly skilled people to work in our labour market and to invest in our labour market. But if their preferred status is not as attractive, then they will go offshore, they will go and work somewhere else. That is inevitable. We're in a global industry. The global television industry is now worth $500 billion. It's the biggest entertainment sector on the planet. And people seek high-quality individuals, much like they seek high-quality doctors or other British personnel, and that's not good for our economy. We want to be attracting and retaining these people in the most favourable way, because there are plenty other competing countries who would like to attract them themselves, including Ireland, for my sector.
Lord Marks.
Yes, I just wonder, from the three different sectors that you represent, there's some recognition that maybe HMRC have got a point about the present situation, that there is significant ways around, given the flexible labour market and what's been done, of actually discouraging people paying their tax, and more particularly perhaps their national insurance, and that there is a major problem of employee-based arrangements being undermined, a bit like the construction industry is a classic. I know you're not representing that, but a classic where that has clearly been the case, and that regular employment has become a small minority experience. And I'm wondering if you see any virtue at all in the HMRC approach here, that maybe they have got a point, and we've got to find a way of addressing it in a way that's fairer than the current situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly coming from my sector, I mean, a lot of this debate was started because of the BBC changing the employment status of a number of employees to personal service companies, and that's not been a happy story for them, shall we say. And you know, my view about that is generally if you're working full time for one employer, you're an employee, and as the BBC people were, effectively they were employees who then went through a change of tax status to become personal service countries. I don't think any of us are arguing that we shouldn't be paying appropriate tax or national insurance contributions. It's basically come out with a system which is fair, which isn't a huge burden on business, and which actually moves us forward, I think, is what we would all seek. We all invest and we all benefit from the infrastructure in our country, from education, from roads and all the other things that we rely on as businesses. So I don't think any of us don't want to be paying appropriate tax. But that would then take me to another point where British media companies are competing against global media companies who don't pay tax here. So maybe the HMRC and government might want to spend a bit more time thinking about how they would pay appropriate tax into an economy which they benefit from as well.
Can you help me? I'm just thinking about that point you've just made about, you know, if someone's employed doing a job, then clearly they're an employee. Just thinking about some of these brilliant cameramen that we see, you know, who will sit for a whole month in order to get some insect to do something for David Attenborough's programme that becomes 10 seconds, which have become so fantastic earners for our country. If you're such a cameraman, you're going to be in high demand because that's a huge skill. And you're probably going, without personalising it, you're probably going to be self-employed.
You will. Yeah. Inevitably.
And so I'm just trying to get what you said earlier. You might be spending 3 months, I don't know, in Uganda pointing your camera at some gorillas or something. And you might be working for one of your members.
Or the BBC.
Or the BBC. But to my mind, that is not inconsistent with being... you're not really employed because you're a contractor who's providing a specialist service.
And generally you will be bringing specialist equipment as part of that.
So if I'm that bloke, and I mean, I've done these fantastic films, I'm in demand all over the world. And so if you say to me, I want you to be employed.
Yes.
I'm going to tell you to...
You will be quite impolite about that, I imagine. Not yourself, Lord Forsyth, obviously. That would be a slight on your good manners. But that would be the conflict, because I would be put in a position as the producer, whoever I produce for, saying, well, you either take it or you leave it, and you can say, I'll leave it. I'll go and work for HBO. I'll go and work for Discovery.
So you take Lord Monks's point, which he made about, you know, the abuses on construction sites and everything else. How do we resolve this then? Is it by having there's a sort of value chain on this as well. So you're the cameraman, you make me an award-winning, very distributable, sellable show about the life of the mayfly on the English chalk streams. Oh yeah. I'm a fly fisherman, so that's so
essentially
yes. Now you've got me interested.
Oh, very good. And it's a global success, okay? So you're paid for that. You may have also shared in some revenues from the sales of that programme, depending on your particular negotiation, which you will pay tax on. I'm the BBC worldwide. I sell that programme globally. I am paying tax on that as well. So there's tax paid on all the transactions involved in that original piece of work that you did, as well as you paying tax for the income you receive for the camera company that you work for. So now, what those contributions are, or how we contribute, but I am, as an employer, I am paying you a premium as a contracted company. You are getting some sort of benefit for that as a company. You will be paying tax appropriately for that employment or for that contract that I offered you.
Who owns the camera?
Sorry?
Who owns the camera?
Often the camera is hired. I would hire the camera from Lord Forsyth as part of the contract. But he would own the camera, and he would obviously make capital deductions for that piece of equipment as anyone else would.
Okay. Okay.
Very good. Lord Benjamin, yeah.
No, just a couple of quick points listening to you. First of all, I'd like to get some idea of the size of your representations. So,
okay.
How many?
Yeah, so we have around 3,000 independent health professionals, and that includes doctors, nurses, radiographers.
About 3,000.
Okay. My sector, I represent independent production companies. We have about 550 companies across the UK. Global turnover is now in excess of 3.2 billion. More than half of that is non-UK earnings. But the creative industries are worth 150 billion to the UK economy, 70,000 SMEs, and the predominant employment status is freelance.
Yeah. So 70,000 SMEs
in the creative industries, but 150 billion to the UK economy.
Yes.
So
no, that's good.
And
what about oil and gas?
And oil and gas, so you're talking 30 to 40 of the major oil companies, plus underneath that the supply chain of about, we represent another 350 companies, the oil companies as well working with us. And then beyond that, in terms of the total SME organisation, you can get up to about 8,000 different companies that actually represent them. And then there's a vast number of individual traders underneath that instead.
You've got some idea of that vast number?
Directionally, we think there's about 250,000 people employed in the entire industry, of which you're talking maybe 50,000 or so, in that kind of number there.
Mr. McVeigh.
Yes, I'd just like to add one point to the construction analogy. We are not in the construction industry. The people who work in film and television, the creative industries, are highly skilled creative people who work on something because it's creatively engaging. They're not just making a plasterboard wall. They're doing an animation for children's, and they're skilled graphics artists. So it's not, they're not the same thing. When we say freelance, they're very different types of activities.
I don't know if you've ever tried to build a wall, but there is some.
Yes, well, I'm not saying there's not a craft or skill in it, but creative people choose, because of their location and their skills, to work on different
It's in
things.
the nature of their employment. Yeah. Lord Desai.
No, I'm still trying to grapple with this idea of uncertainty of employment or variability of earnings being a mark of a genuinely self-employed person.
Yeah.
Now, it may be an exception in your case that people may be self-employed as a health professional, but they may have employment around here. So is there any way one can really genuinely say self-employment involves uncertainty, risk, variability of earnings, and therefore their treatment for tax purposes should allow for, let's say, averaging over 3 years or something like that? Because that would allow for the uncertainty of income, as sometimes you do with creative professions anyway. Would that somehow solve this problem?
The case law, which the legislation requires them to look at, already does look at these aspects. So that this is financial risk and being in business on your own account is really what we're cutting into here. The problem is that it is very difficult for clients to make such judgment calls. I agree. I mean, even if we more formalised the way in which that decision were made, that might be useful. But the reality is that the case law actually does a beautiful job, if you look at it, of separating employment and self-employment. Some very learned judges have done some really fantastic things in working out these tests. The problem is it requires someone equally learned, someone very well versed to do it. So if you could, I don't know, put that in a neat, succinct and easy to appreciate way, and make people consider it, yes, it might be helpful. But I think the difficulty is going to be what form of words is going to do it, and whether clients are going to engage with it because they've got so much admin burden. That's kind of why we suggested almost remove all ambiguity, make it a straight election, and then let's just have a contractor levy. You just charge them a set percentage, you'll recoup the same. You don't need to deal with these really nuanced, difficult assessments.
Lord Bridges.
Just finally, sorry, a bit of a technical point, but coming back to CEST and what we've just been talking about, can CEST ever really get round these kind of nuanced legal points, especially if it doesn't address mutuality of obligation? I know, Ms Abrams, in your evidence, which thanks, you're saying that it's too early to say whether you can make an assessment as to its utility. I don't know what others feel about it, but especially on those points, is it fit for purpose and what should be done about it?
I think, first and foremost, we start out usually by saying overall approach. The case law is quite clear. If you go back to the case of Lorimer versus Hall, it's a very oft-cited, one of the most cited case law examples. It says we should not adopt mechanistic approaches. It says that it's effectively you paint a picture from accumulation of brushstrokes and stand back and view the overall painting. That says I'm looking up at the big painting above me. That's a very enduring metaphor. Now, the problem is it explicitly says no mechanistic approaches, but what you've got is a machine running a mechanical tool, running a flowchart, effectively, which weighs up the same outcomes equally every time, which is exactly what the case law says don't do. So can the CEST tool be improved? I think it's the wrong approach to start with. And all the guidance you see from the case law suggests don't do that kind of thing. Then you get into all the other things you've said. So admitting mutuality of obligation is one of the best tools in the case law. It's never going to get the right result. And then if you even input previous historic cases into, if you work out what the answer would be, it gets the wrong answer, or it gets the right answer on completely the wrong reason.
Have you done that?
Oh yes, well, in fact I can even...
Can you give us some examples?
I can actually forward you a detailed working through of all the main sort of cases that have been looked at that will show you that, yes.
Well, that would be very helpful.
That by the way...
Something to read next weekend.
To give credit where it's due, Lord Forsyth, that was Contractor Calculator did that one, so I can forward that on to you certainly.
Thank you. Right.
On our side, when 15% comes up with an already defined as an incorrect answer, and then when you go into other tools that have come onto the market and tools that our members have developed to help, and they come up with different answers to the different situations again and again and again, then no, it does not give us the way of actually going forward on this. The uncertainty is something that's across the board. We need to get to actually talk about tax law in uncertainty seems a little bit of a contradiction.
You agree?
I concur. I mean, also in my industry, we use multiple companies for using the current creative industries tax credits that goes across games and film and TV. We set up special purpose vehicles, which only exist for the purposes of that production. They don't exist going forward, so if there was any dispute with HMRC, it becomes a horrendous burden, legal, accounting, audit nightmare. And I think overall, clearly, I refer to my previous comments about everyone wants to make sure we make our contributions to the Exchequer, but it's got to be done in a way that's sensible and reasonable, and also make sure that we don't drive away or cause problems with inward investment. We are one of Europe's most successful audiovisual economy. Large amounts of investment, over $1 billion last year in film, come to this country because of our very clear employment practices.
Okay, perhaps I can just abuse my position by asking one final question, which I appreciate you've got members who will have different views about things, but in my head I'm thinking, do people want the Chancellor to do his tweaks or to delay, or do they want him to actually say, do you know what, we've got into a tangle here, let's start again and do something different? Now, where are you on that?
I think we should do something different, and I think we should look at, as the government committed to the coalition government, where they will look at the Office of Tax Simplification. Well, it seems completely contrary to that. This is not a simplification. This is more complexity and more burden. So I think if where we're going in the world, I think it's an opportunity for any government to look at our overall tax system. More and more people, I have 3 children who might be called millennials, they see self-employment as their future. Multiple contracts, multiple careers, I think that's a good thing. I think we should be having an economy that encourages people to be self-employed or set up their own small businesses. I mean, one of the interesting things when I was working on the sector deal on the industrial strategy was the UK is number 3 in the world for setting up SMEs, but we're number 13 for getting to scale. And a lot of that is the burden placed on SMEs in terms of being flexible and being able to compete in the global economy.
Right, we get the picture. Yeah.
I think, Lord Forsyth, you were on the money when you said that we think you should probably not roll this out and have a complete rethink. I think there are perhaps better ways of addressing this, not to have all this uncertainty about it and not to predispose clients to make risk-averse decisions, as we'd said. And nobody minds if they stick their hands up and own up to a mistake. I think that's statesmanly.
Now, Mr Abrahams, you've got members who've spent a lot of money on getting this prepared, so what's your view?
Forsyth, if there was to be a meaningful reconsideration of the actual facts, then obviously from our members, then that would be appreciated. But if we were to have a delay just to come back to where we are just now, that would not be helpful.
Great. Thank you so much. That's really helpful.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
We don't need to do anything else.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.